I don't know how this all happens, but it's going to make for an interesting conversation in heaven someday where I can say, okay, Jesus, I know you started working on that. Tell me what was going on. Let me into the boardroom and see what was going on between you and the angels and how you worked all that out. It's going to be an interesting and fun conversation. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Hereafter Heaven. I'm Mike McKinsey, author of the best-selling book, I Held the Hand of Jesus in Heaven. Today, I'm going to share with you the miracle that fulfilled the prophecy that Jesus told me in the hospital room, that millions would hear our story. It's pretty interesting how this happened, and I honestly believe it's a miracle. And then at the end of this episode, I want to introduce you to something that we're going to be doing every once in a while regarding my book. If you have put a review on Amazon, I'm gonna take a look at those, and I'm gonna read some of them because the reviews are really good. I got a great review from John Burke, and I really appreciate that. He gave me a 5-star review and wrote some really kind words. But I got a 1-star review, and it's actually kind of funny. So I do want to talk to you after we talk about this this miracle that fulfilled Jesus' prophecy. But first, when I was 5 years old, and I asked God to show me heaven. It brings up when that little kid said that prayer. It brings up a bigger point that I'd kind of like to convey. That when you pray, whether the answer is no immediately or yes or someday, and in my case, 40 years later, it's going to be answered, heaven is activated. Jesus it hears those prayers, and he says, okay, we got to put something into place here. And our God is a God of dramatic stories. He loves dramatic stories. You can tell just by reading the Bible. Look at David and Goliath. I mean, does it get any more dramatic than that? A kid goes up and kills a giant with a stone and then cuts off his head with his own sword. I love that story. It's my favorite Bible story. What about Moses parting the Red Sea, or Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead after 4 days? That's as dramatic as it gets. So you got to remember, he loves these dramatic stories. And I think when I prayed that prayer, I could just picture the angels, being brought in, God saying, okay, guys, here's the deal. We're going to make a dramatic story, but this is going to take a little work. This little 5-year-old kid needs to meet a certain woman. They have to have certain kids. These kids need to be interested in baseball because it's going to take a twisting motion that's going to rupture my appendix. He has to live a life where he doesn't lose his appendix. So for 45 years, we got to make sure that doesn't happen. I've got to have him away from his home so that he can't just go into his doctor's office. If I was home, I would have just gone to my doctor. They probably would have said, no, you need surgery now. And it wouldn't have been as dramatic, but it was at a wedding, and it was a crazy scenario. So God had to put all those things in place. Had to have my son meet his wife. They had to live 5 hours away from home. I mean, all this stuff, and to answer that prayer. And I think they worked on it. I don't know how this all happens, but it's going to make for an interesting conversation in heaven someday, where I can say, okay, Jesus, I know you started working on that. Tell me what was going on. Let me into the boardroom and see what was going on between you and the angels and how you worked all that out. It's going to be an interesting and fun conversation. So the miracle that happened is Jesus told me in the hospital room, millions are going to hear our story. And of course, that I told him, hey, I'm not Billy Graham. I'm not doing this. You got the wrong guy. It's probably what, Moses said, what Noah said. You get these great big revelations from Jesus, and you're like, I can't do that. Moses put up a fight. He's like, I got this speech impediment. I can't do that. And I was the same way. I said, I'm not Billy Graham. I can't talk to millions of people. I mean, I don't like talking to a small group of people. But as time went on in my life, Jesus kept putting me in front of bigger and bigger crowds, talking to bigger crowds. I went from, 10 little league parents to running organizations with 500 people. And I was talking to all of them at one time. And I got pretty good at it, and it didn't bother me. I still wasn't talking about Jesus, but but that would come. So 8 years after my near-death experience, I published a book. I published it as fiction because I wanted to play with the idea that heaven was a physical place right now. Like, could God hide that from us somewhere out there in the universe? I mean, obviously he could. So I had kind of a fun take on that. And but then after 8 years, I wrote that book. I didn't sell a million copies, so that when Jesus said millions are going to hear our story, that was always kind of in the back of my mind. But I just thought, okay, maybe it's possible that if I sell 10,000 books, that somehow, somewhere, a million people will read it. And I thought, I did my part. I pretty much closed the book. 12 years later, now this is 12 years after, and you got to think back 12 years ago. So I think social media was just getting started around 2007, 8, maybe. Facebook came around. I think we had MySpace before that, but that was kind of the big explosion around 2006, maybe. I don't know. So, and I think I just started having an email address back then too, which I didn't use much. I don't think most people did, but I wasn't in the tech field. So I can't say for sure, but I can't remember using email until much later. The point is, 12 years after Accidental Heaven came out, my first fiction book, and this is now 20 years after my NDE, I get an email from someone named Carolyn, and she runs Guideposts. And Guideposts is a Christian publication. They used to put out these little books. My mom got them all the time in the mail, like once a month. And they branched out and they were doing all these different books, Christian books. And I got this email from this lady named Carolyn. She says, "Hey, I'm the publisher at Guideposts. I'd like to know if I could put your near-death experience story in one of our books." And she said it'll be in there with like 3 other stories, NDE stories. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, I don't even know how she got my email. But I said, yeah, sure. Why not? They paid me a little bit of money to cover my expenses and my time talking to their writer. And I probably made $1 an hour, when I think back on how much money they paid me and how much time I spent talking to this lady. But we would email each other. So they had their writer contact me, and we would email each other and talk on the phone. And it was just hours and hours and hours of content. And so after about 4 months, she put it all together. She sent it into Guideposts. They put it in this book called Glimpses of Eternity. It was in their Witnessing Heaven series. And I was really proud of it. I thought, wow, there's, now I've got Accidental Heaven out there, and this other story, that's kind of cool. And always in the back of my mind, it was like, well, maybe this is how millions are going to hear our story, because of this book. And I thought, I should do some marketing for them, but didn't really give it much thought. And I talked to the author about it. She says, I don't think they would mind. So I'm watching YouTube one day, just scrolling through, seeing what's going on. And I come across this guy and talking to another guy, and the setup looked pretty cool, kind of got my attention. It was a big long table, and it was all black behind him. And there was one guy on the right side talking, asking questions, and another guy on the left at the other end of the table. Huge table. It was like 12 feet. And I hear Jesus in the same voice that I heard in the hospital. I hear him say, "I want you to contact him." And I was like, "What?" And he said again, "I want you to contact him." And I said, "Contact who?" And of course, this is the way Jesus talks to me. He says a few words. I ask for details and I don't get them. So then I'm kind of figuring out myself. And I said, am I supposed to contact? Or I said, how am I supposed to contact this guy? I think his name was Steve. He was a pastor in Florida. And the host was named Stacy McCants. And he has a Stronger Faith podcast. And he was just getting started, but he had just set up this studio in his house. And that was really what got my attention. And I think it was like his second or third episode where he's talking to Steve. I asked Jesus, I said, how am I going to contact this guy? And he says, contact the host. So this is before I knew how any of this stuff worked on YouTube, but I looked under the description and it said, if you have a story that's Christ honoring and you want to share it, here's how you get a hold of us, email us. So I thought, okay, Jesus just told me to email or talk to this guy, so I better follow through. So I emailed Stacy and I said, hey, I had a near-death experience. It's been a while, but this story just came out in Glimpses of Eternity from Guideposts. And here's my number if you want to talk. And like 10 minutes later, after sending that email, Stacy called me and he said, man, I'm really interested in near-death experiences. Tell me about it. I think we spent like an hour and a half on the phone. And like 2 weeks later, I was in that studio sitting down talking to Stacy about my near-death experience. And it's the first time I'd gone public with it, really, in any kind of large forum. I mean, I had talked to our church. I talked to our Sunday school. Of course, I told my friends that I thought I was crazy when I got to the second part. But so I sat down and told Stacy the whole thing. And like 2.5 hours went by, like in the blink of an eye. I just talked, and all the way there, he was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So it was about a 3-hour drive. And the whole way there, I'm just praying. I'm saying, God, I don't really know if I'm doing the right thing. I know you said contact him. So this one's on you, Lord. I need the Holy Spirit to talk for me. So we get done, and it was really a fun experience. And Stacy became a good friend. So a couple days later, Stacy calls me and he says, hey, I got some bad news. We lost all the audio, like every bit of the audio. I've had people going through this forensically, trying to figure out where it went. He says, I don't know what happened. And he says, so, if you want, we can meet like halfway. Like I'll drive an hour and a half, you drive an hour and a half. We can meet somewhere and do this over again. And I said, you know what, Stacy? I'm not going to give Satan his way. I'm not going to block this story. Not after all of this. I said, let's redo it. And he said, I'd love to. So a couple weeks later, I made the drive again, sat down with him, and it was a completely different interview. But it was still telling the NDE story, but I think the Holy Spirit just wasn't happy with that first take, and he wanted me to bring up a couple other things. So we sat down, and I think that one was almost 3 hours long. I mean, I'm sure Stacy had to edit it a little bit, but so that was my first public appearance talking about my near-death experience. And of course, after you do that, I think it was next was Randy Kay. He contacted me and he said, we'd like to interview you. And then I had a couple others. And then, once you're on the NDE circuit, if for lack of a better term, you get a lot of calls. And so after all those podcast appearances and radio and television, and I've even had newspaper articles. One of the funnest ones I did was in Australia and New Zealand. It was like a lifestyle magazine, and there was a newspaper article, magazines. I mean, you add it all up, we're well over 20 million views, and that just blows me away. Because if it wasn't for the miracle of that lady contacting me 12 years after my book came out, I wouldn't have a podcast. I wouldn't have a new book. None of this would have happened. So that led to that was a miracle. And I asked Carolyn later. In fact, when I published I Held the Hand of Jesus in Heaven, I contacted her and I said, are you interested in publishing this book? And she said, we did those NDE stories, but we're out. We're kind of out of that business. We're not into the prophetic stuff anymore. We're not into the near-death experience. She said, there's plenty of other people covering those stories, and we just don't do it anymore. And I asked her, how did you get my email? Like, how did you even know to contact me? And she says, to be honest with you, I don't remember. So chalk up a miracle for God and for Jesus for getting that whole ball of wax rolling. Ball of wax? Yeah. Anyway, it works. So what I wanted to do is talk to you about my book, I Held the Hand of Jesus in Heaven. I've gotten, as of the taping of this episode, I've got 90 reviews. Okay, I'm gonna pull one up, and I want to read it to you. I've gotten, I think it's like how the Amazon goes from 1 to 5 star ratings. I think we're at 4.6, something like that, 4.7. Not it. Story's not for everybody. I mean, some people just may not like it. That's fine. I'd love to have a review. In fact, that's one of the things I wanted to mention. If you've read my book, leave a review. I mean, I might bring up your review and read it on the air on this feature. So this will be the reviews feature. I'm not sure if we'll give it a cool name or whatever, but I wanted to read this one because it brings up a larger point, which a lot of things do. So this is a 1 star review, and please don't think that if you give me a 1 star review, I'm going to read it on the air. I should probably start with some of the best ones. Maybe I'll read John Burke's later. But this one caught my attention. Okay. It's from somebody named WN, just the initials WN. And it says it's a 1 star verified purchase. Doesn't ring true with my spirit. I'm sorry, but I can't recommend this book, as I don't believe the author's encounter with Jesus was genuine. Well, yes, it was, but that's open for interpretation. I don't have a problem with that. After reading close to 24 near-death experience books, this one does not fit the usual experience, common to almost all others. First problem, when given the choice to stay with Jesus, he wants to return to earth. I thought about, and this is a quote from the book, I thought about all the things I'd leave behind: dog, play golf, walks on the beach, coffee, and wine. Nobody, when shown Jesus and heaven's glory, wants to go back. Okay, here's where I have a problem. I wasn't given a choice. So what happened was Jesus walked into the operating room, holds out his hand, and he says, I want to answer your prayer. So and this is where my NDE is a little bit different from everybody else. I didn't float away from my body. This was physical Jesus walking in, and I was a physical person still in my body. And I see this man hold out his hand. I know it's Jesus. And he says, I want to answer your prayer. Now I'm confused. I'm thinking, okay, great. My prayer, I just prayed with my wife to guide the surgeon's hand and that everything would go well, that we would, get out of the hospital quickly, right? Those kind of things. I mean, typical pre-surgery prayer. Jesus says, I want to answer your prayer. He's not talking about that prayer. So I was really confused. And I was confused anyway, because I thought, I've never really thought of Jesus as a physical person. Obviously he was, and he still is, but I never really thought of him that way. Like I always think of Jesus as a God, and I always thought of God as a spirit. I didn't really think of him walking physically into the operating room, but here he was. So when she says he was given the choice, he would have never come back, I wasn't given the choice. And what she's referring to with the coffee and the wine and walking on the beach and the dogs, I didn't really give my kids a proper goodbye, because I thought it's going to be a routine thing. I'm going to be out of here in a couple of days. I'll see him tomorrow. No big deal. But that did go through my mind. Like, wait, I love playing golf. I haven't had a hole in one yet, so I was thinking of all those things that I would miss. But it's not like Jesus said, well, do you want to stay with me, or do you want to go back? And I don't know, like after seeing heaven, the only part that I saw, I'm not one of the guys that's a heavenly tourist. Okay. So I was not given the choice to go back. And even so, I had young kids at home that need their dad. I don't know if I would have stayed, but that doesn't mean that heaven wasn't this wonderful place, but I didn't get the full effect of heaven. And I think if I had, I probably would have said, there's no way I'm going back. I'll stay busy up here. I'll feather the nest and get it ready for my wife and my kids, and bring the dogs up later, and and all of that. I can wait, but I was not given that choice. So she says, she or he, nobody when shown that Jesus and heaven's glory wants to go back. Second problem, he has a second NDE almost immediately afterwards, and Jesus says, I had to get you flat on your back away from all the distractions so you could hear me. Huh? He was clinically dead with Jesus previously, and Jesus couldn't get his attention or complete what he had to say the first time? I'd steer clear of this book. Okay. Yes, I had an NDE, But this was a very specific answer to a prayer, to a childhood prayer, a 40-year-old childhood prayer. I didn't get, like I've said earlier, I'm not a heavenly tourist. I didn't get to see all of heaven. I was just shown a glimpse. I was really shown just enough to where Jesus says, that's all you get. I'm going to keep your appetite hungry for more, so that you know it's real, but that's all you get. That's all you're going to see. So she says, I had a second NDE. I actually didn't have a second near-death experience. I was laying on my back with pneumonia, and I am, again, in my physical body. I never left my body a second time. And Jesus walked in again as a physical person, but I couldn't see him. But I knew he was there. And we had a 3-hour conversation. So the larger point that I want to make is, gosh, sometimes you can put something right in front of somebody's face. She says she read the book. He read the book, whoever it is. I'm not sure about what the comprehension was, but they just got it wrong. I'd never had a second NDE. And so anyway, there's my little feature. If you've read the book, please go on Amazon, give me a review. Give me more than 1 star. I'd love that. Unless you hate the book, then say you hated it. That's fine. I can handle it. I have big shoulders. I've been called so many names for sticking my neck out for Jesus, you wouldn't believe. I've been called some pretty awful things. I've even been called Satan himself, that I'm the angel of darkness, and which kind of blows me away because I point everyone to Jesus. That's the ultimate goal here, is to have people look into Jesus. If I can't convince somebody that they should follow Jesus, I want to be the mustard seed in their life. And I think that's good advice to leave you with too. We can't all lead someone to the Lord. It's just not going to happen. I would love to lead millions to the Lord. I don't know what my impact for the kingdom is going to be, and neither do you, because there's always a ripple effect. But if we can just be a small part in reaching people for Jesus and pointing everyone towards Jesus, I think that's a great goal to have in life. So until next time, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate all your support. Go give me an Amazon review. We'll talk about it later. God bless you.